Hello and welcome to the No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast. Chris, you've just watched a film. When I say just, obviously I don't mean right just now, seconds ago. I mean you've recently watched a film that was on our podcast list.
Yeah, it's been on the list, I think, quite a while actually.
What's
But
it called?
as above, so below.
Right.
I'm pretty sure Anyanka asked about it at some point.
I believe it was on Yanka. It was the French one, wasn't it, where they go down under the ground or something?
Yeah. So they
Okay.
go under the catacombs looking for what they call the Eternity Stone, which is essentially the Philosopher's Stone of Mr. Nicholas Flamel.
Ah. So, is it a film now is still fresh in your mind that you would recommend to our listeners or occultists in general, or do you think it's not that great?
Um, I'm not going to suggest that anyone should rush out and watch it. It's one of
Mm,
those things that's interesting enough to watch.
mm,
It's a decent concept. I just think, like I've said to you before, like I think if they'd have removed the gore in
mm,
order to explore the psychological stuff more,
mm.
you'd have had a better movie.
Right.
Um, and for all the kind of, I think, what did you call it, strobe kind of
Yeah.
stuff, where they show you show you glimpses of things.
Stroboscopic effect.
Those would have had a better effect if it wasn't for the gore.
Right.
Um, because I was just kind of constantly just preparing myself for something to jump out at me,
Mm,
rather than paying attention to what is probably really clever camera work.
mm.
I think the thing that really annoyed me, because it's one of those movies that I compare all of them to the Blair Witch Project, but
Right.
that I don't think that's really that. I don't know if that was the first that did that. I know Cloverfield did a similar thing, that kind of first person camera angles. Like at least with this one, it was well done in the sense
Mm,
that they'd all got, because they were underground, they'd got like minor cap things on,
right.
um, like underground like lights, and what he'd done is so-called installed cameras into them,
Mm,
so you'd got that kind of, it switched from person to person,
mm,
so you'd see each other's views of what was going on. And because it was all kind of catacombsy, like there was constantly like shadows and stuff that could play with you psychologically.
mm.
All of that was really good, but it was kind of ruined by the unnecessary gore.
Right.
Um, so it was just kind of like, yeah, I was just, I think I'd have enjoyed it more if it was less horror and more psychological thriller, because I just think the concept was really clever. Um, so it's all about a kind of archaeologist, kind of historian woman who's kind of picking up where dad left off,
Mm.
and it kind of apparently like sent dad crazy and he hung himself. So it's kind of
Right.
like she's finishing off his story,
Yeah.
like of the kind of like the mystery that got away. Um, and like they did really clever parts with the kind of as above, so below,
Mm.
for kind of, it was all kind of puzzle solving,
Okay.
um, kind of proper ancient secret kind of puzzle solving. So like multiple languages, like um, but I feel like it's one of those movies where you get to the end and you've got more questions than you started with.
Yeah.
Like it was good in that sense. Um, but the gore just ruined it for me. Like,
Mm.
um, yeah, just unnecessary. But the concept was clever. So kind of playing with this kind of underground catacombs, looking for where Nicholas Flamel like left his body to rest, and then there's like all these kind of puzzles with like mirrored chambers, and at one point there's like a Ptolemaic lock, where you kind of like um, the Egyptians would make these tunnels that if you moved one stone, it opened a lock into a next part. But if you move the wrong stone, the whole thing would just fall on your head.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like there were lots of things like that were hidden in, and just kind of like that would have kept the occultist kind of thinking, oh, that's clever. And anyone that's had like a kind of historical background, but that it was just disappointing otherwise.
So there's a theme then, essentially, that you could find mirrored in lots of films, but I suppose in general in the occult world. And that's this idea of puzzles.
Yeah.
But what is the reason for the puzzles? Because when you look at like the Indiana Jones films and stuff like that, where there's various puzzles, they're normally designed to keep the unworthy out, aren't they?
Yeah. It's all about
There's
gatekeeping.
some sort of treasure, and it's supposed to stop the unworthy people from finding the treasure at the end of it. So there's really, I believe, two types of puzzles. There's the puzzles which try to stop people from getting to the end result or getting the thing that is at the end of the film, game, quest, whatever. And then there's the ones which is the actual transmutation. So actually, there isn't really anything at the end. It's just you yourself have potentially changed, having gone through all these trials, tribulations, and quests and such. So, with that, that kind of reminds me of the Philosopher's Stone. So, what's your understanding of the Philosopher's Stone? And then I was wondering if we may potentially talk a little bit about alchemy in real life, Philosopher's Stones and such, because that's the sort of stuff that I don't think we've talked about before. And I don't
No.
think other people have really asked all that much about. But I've got some views on the Philosopher's Stone and such. I wonder what your views on it are.
So kind of pulling at the threads that you've already kind of set there, kind of, ultimately alchemy is about transmutation, transformation. And I think what's clever about alchemy, or at least in the way in which kind of like, Nicholas Flamel and Trismegistus, that all those kind of people, Emerald Tablet kind of stuff. Like what I think is often missed, because again, you know how I struggle with the learning knowledge for knowledge's sake, like that kind of armchair magician problem of kind of chasing and solving a puzzle just to actually kind of go at the end, well, I now know how that works.
Yeah.
We both quite like a practical application as well, rather than just kind of what would I normally call it? Theoretical masturbation.
Theoretical masturbation, yeah.
That kind of, where you just kind of actually the journey's not just what it's necessarily about all the time. But I think for alchemy, too much focus is on the properties of turning lead into gold, or base metals into gold rather, because one, that kind of is an outdated concept now, on the sense that although gold has its great value, if it hadn't got a bullion stamp on somewhere, people are going to ask some questions. Whereas in the olden days,
melt it down and change the numbers and such, can't you? That's why gold's quite favoured.
So you just kind of like, there is that kind of part of going, okay, well, you would have to surely, find some way of getting it into the system now. Whereas once upon a time, if you were just producing copious amounts of gold, you just make lots of people happy. Like, whereas now I think it comes with too much side problem hustling required.
So is that what you dislike about gold, that you were unable to shift all that Nazi gold that's sitting in your amber room somewhere in an undisclosed location?
Hey, I was not around for the Nazi party, thank you very much.
Yeah,
so
that's
I am not
we're sticking to. That's the story we're sticking to.
That's
isn't
the
it?
story we're sticking to. I was not here.
No.
Or at least I wasn't helping in a corporeal form.
Now the plot's changed somewhat.
So I said I wasn't here. I was not here physically.
Right. So
So
the
can't be blamed for any of that.
the idea that I like with alchemy, when you look at it, when you not, I wouldn't say study it, but when you look at alchemy and you know try to research a little bit about what the fuck is this alchemy stuff I hear about, the alchemical alchemist's archetype and such, is that there's this idea of turning lead into gold. Oh, look, there's before we had chemistry, we had alchemy type thing. All of these people were getting paid obscene amounts of money by kings and queens and emperors and such in order to try and find a way to chemically, physically change lead into gold. And then you've got more of the occultist side of things that come along to say, well, actually, the lead is the alchemist, and the gold
Yeah.
is some sort of transmutation into some sort of ascension, which is no different than
Yes.
what monks and that do, sitting cross-legged on the floor or practicing their martial arts.
Yeah.
And that the only difference is the alchemists have decided that, oh, we'll convince some king and queen that we can do this. They'll fund us. Whereas the monks just create a religion, don't they?
Yes, and then the gold is just handed to them
Yeah.
in the donation trays that go around during mass.
Either way, people wanting to commit their lives to the study of progression in some way, shape, or form, working out actually we need some sort of money because it's real difficult to ascend and put a lot of development into yourself and that if you're having to work a 60-hour week, which I can relate to. And I think a lot of listeners might be able to relate to with them trying to balance a mundane life with the magical life,
Magical one.
trying to make progression and stuff. With that's even come up today, hasn't it? When we talked to someone earlier, if you
Yeah.
worked all day in the coal mines, what time have you got to study the occult sciences? And if you can't read or write, you haven't really got much of a chance, have you? One of the reasons, which again is something that's come up today, it's like, well, if you want to pursue witchcraft magic and stuff, it's not like that's one of the things that everyone knows necessarily. So if you can do it, you might want to use that to support yourself. So this idea of like cunning folk practice and such like that. If you really wanted to delve into it, it might be a good idea to actually put your skills to good use and make some money out of it. It's no different than someone that's interested in, you know, herbology and such, opening up greenhouses and selling herbs and stuff like that and plants and that. Maybe even becoming a herbalist and selling the old remedy. I don't really know. But from looking from the outside of alchemy, it looks so fucking complicated. And they're thus surrounded by mystery, but also puzzles that need to be solved. Like, I don't know many alchemists. In fact, I don't know, maybe one alchemist actually. I know one alchemist that has ever put any sort of effort into making it easier for other people to follow the alchemical path. It's all about trying to stop people from following the alchemical path by making it obscenely fucking difficult in a
And I think
very
that's
mercurial way.
partly what I liked about the show or the movie was at least you got a hint of that. You
Yeah.
got a hint of that it's a rabbit warren that you are potentially going to have to go down alone because very few people are going to want to come with you. And I think that was the kind of interesting part about that and the relationship with like one of the guys that was going with her. He was only really there to help with translation because she got him in trouble before. So she'd left him in like a Turkish prison or something. So they just kind of like, you know, there was this kind of Tomb Raider like need to chase a puzzle just to find out what was the other side. I think from an alchemical point of view, like going beyond the kind of base level stuff and kind of talking about changing of oneself, kind of whether or not you want to call that enlightenment or whatever it is, it's not something particularly, I suppose, I chase in any way, shape or form, which doesn't mean that I don't value it as a pathway. again, it's just a very solitary one.
Yeah.
So, and I think in some ways I don't feel like necessarily people are making it hard on purpose, but it's just that it's such a personal journey that I don't think it's easy to leave breadcrumbs behind for something like that, because it's such a personal journey that unless that person is just like you, like a living relative, like a daughter or a grandchild or something that wants to then walk in your footsteps later, I feel like alchemy very much is a kind of hereditary tradition, or like a fraternal one, which is normally why it's kind of associated with kind of Freemasonry and other kind of black lodges, is because there's some kind of hereditary, like there's the genuine risk that you're not going to be able to complete it in a lifetime, so the need to kind of leave enough breadcrumbs for somebody else to pick up at a later date. Whereas I don't feel like a lot of other magical practitioners on different pathways, even those that are slightly more esoteric, are necessarily having to plan because they know they'll just pick it up next time. Whereas I think alchemy becomes a very kind of third dimensional obsession where you suddenly have to kind of, oh, fuck, I'm going to have to either leave clues for somebody else, which I think is where the worthiness comes in, is a fact of kind of like, this is my personal journey. I'll leave you some, but you've got to work for it because I did. And there's that kind of, so I think part of that kind of leaches in to that kind of process. Whereas the kind of personal development stuff is what we're all about, like generally speaking, not necessarily from an alchemical point of view. One thing you said earlier that kind of like really bugs me about what other people say when they look back at alchemy, and they kind of say how, oh, alchemy was science before we had it, kind of thing. I really hate that, because I don't think it's accurate.
No.
Kind of, alchemy was one of a set of sciences, along with astronomy and mathematics, that were the sciences.
Well, they equate it with chemistry. They say it's
You
early
know,
form of chemistry,
and
but it isn't.
it's not.
It's has too much philosophy in it to
Yeah,
be chemistry.
yeah. It can't be chemistry
However,
because
it does echo back to a form of science before when we removed philosophy and art from science.
yes. No, I definitely agree with that. I agree that it's kind of how science should be approached in some ways, and actually only gets close now when you talk about string theory and kind of metaphysics. Is about the only time that you get close to that coming back in.
But you tend to find that a lot of physicists, if you ask them, say you're a scientist, physicists say, I'm not a scientist, I'm a physicist.
Yes.
Even there's a divide within science. Like, why is it that the scientific community don't like to think of theoretical, it's normally theoretical physicists, as scientists? Because they just theorize and such, even if they do, try and back things up as best they can with mathematical equations and finding proof in mathematics. Or whether it is the physicists themselves that want to be divided outside of that. I'm not entirely sure. I found that alchemy is a long meandering stroll. It is not quick. You do not progress quickly within alchemy. It is a very slow-paced meander. It is the scenic kind of twisty, turny, jolly walking the dog very slowly with grandma along the river. It is not a motorway, and it is not even like an A road or a side road. That is a little bit more like witchcraft or other forms of occultism, which is highly practical. I'm not saying that there aren't practicalities found in alchemy, but they tend to be very slow growing. They tend to be very long and drawn out I was gonna say, what can I say? Things that are revealed, revelations. It's probably
Yeah.
the best way to deal with it. Because you have the spageric, you know, idea of taking a plant or something like that and trying to dissect it and take it apart, which you do. You're taking a living organism, you're taking it apart in the physical, you're also taking it apart chemically, and you're also taking it apart magically and energetically. There's a lot that can be revealed from that, which is exactly the alchemist's knowledge and experience and gnosis, but they have to go through a process of doing that. They take each
Mm.
component part and they really meditate on it. The reason why they have to meditate on it is because it takes so fucking long. You have to take this thing and take it apart. And when you look at the alchemy and, you know, essential oils and all that sort of thing, all of these processes take time. And it's during that time and the repetition of doing that that the knowledge sinks in, that these revelations reveal themselves, which is what my understanding of the Philosopher's Stone actually is. Because from the legend of the Philosopher's Stone, it's all about creating some sort of mineral or thing that you can take in order to keep you alive forever. I think that's the general idea of the Philosopher's Stone. Philosopher's Stone. I didn't just get that from Harry Potter, did I? That's general kind of pop culture.
Yeah, so it is the concept of two things. It always focuses on those two things, which is one, base metals into gold, and
Mm,
then the other part is always to help create the elixir of life.
mm,
So that it's a, you know, alchemical compound created.
mm-hmm,
Um, the other part that I struggle with, and feel free to jump on me because I'm sure lots of people will. I find, I kind of find the chemistry aspect of
mm.
alchemy far too simple.
Okay.
So the way in which it's, you know, kind of displayed, and the way in which reducing things quite specifically into very simple categories,
Mm-hmm,
I struggle with,
mm,
because I feel like in order for alchemy to be as complex as it actually is,
mm,
um, in terms of what you're doing energetically on top of what is actually being done in a kind of scientific way, is not well represented in the way in which it's written down.
mm,
And I think that's probably why lots of people kind of fall off this path on its way, because actually I think the amount that's required to be done from an energetic point of view
mm,
is not recorded well.
mm.
Um,
None of
and
it is, though. None of it's recorded. At least within potion making and
mm,
that sort of thing, you have some sort of recordings of formulas and stuff like that. Very often, the formulas themselves are just masked under symbols and such, or poems. It's another very popular one. Um, and the problem with the alchemy is that in order to understand someone else's work, you're actually having to dissect
mm.
some form of symbol or poem or something like that. Is another
I say,
name.
don't get me wrong, the kind of
Yeah,
allegorical part of it I do
yeah.
quite enjoy, but I just kind of find the the base understanding of that just seems
Mm,
far too simple for something so complex.
mm.
And I don't know if it's a kind of lost in translation problem, as in they're not very good at recording it.
Well, they don't though, do they? They don't
You
record
know?
anything. That's the issue. I've always found with alchemy trying to pick up from wherever people have trying to understand other people's thought process.
Hmm.
You don't get that with you if you get some people throughout history. So we'll talk about it from a historical perspective. If you look at Nikola Tesla, who was a genius, didn't fucking write a lot down. He built complicated working three or multi-dimensional, let's say, models in his mind, and he'd create it and keep it all in his mind, and then he'd create a working prototype, which would often work from the very prototype. When you compare that to someone like a Leonardo da Vinci, which Leonardo da Vinci is a little bit more like what you tend to see in the occult world. You see multiple sketches, you see the ideas, they come to life when you look at it. Besides, assuming you understand how to read them, you can see and follow the thought process along. Whereas you don't get that with alchemy. Alchemy is a little bit more like, well, we're not really writing anything down. This is not a note or a white paper or anything like this. This isn't our post-it note, and it literally is in shorthand on a
Mm.
post-it note style thing. And then if there is anything to be recorded and sent out or disseminated, is normally in the form of something super fucking complicated, like a poem or something like that, where they try and flowery it all up to keep others from understanding it, which is one of my biggest issues with alchemy. Is also one of the things that I also find most difficult, which is why I've stuck with it a little bit, is that I hate the fact that people, alchemists, go out of their way, it seems, to make things far more complicated than they need to be.
Mm.
And it is all about hiding the information from others. And I don't know whether it is an unworthiness or whether it is a need to overcomplicate things for, or whether it is something poetic like you do get with certainly with certain religions and stuff, where they say, well, this is so complex that I cannot do it justice by simplifying it. Therefore, I need to keep it in the obscure, which
Mm.
means that you never really reveal it to anyone that isn't already understanding of it, which is where my issue is with it. But then at the same time, it's one of those things that is the process of the alchemist. The alchemist must go through it. That's why with the philosopher's stone, people take the approach that the philosopher's stone is a alchemists want to create the elixir of life so that they can patent it and make a considerable amount of money, making sure that all the rich people pay them bajillions and millions and cotillions of pounds and such in order to, have the secret to eternal life and such. Sell it to some fucking pharmaceutical company or something like that. Whereas I don't get that impression the more I've spent with alchemists and the more I've delved into it. I tend to find that it works an awful lot more like a uh, art project. I don't know, would they call it an MA or something like that? Works a little bit more like that. I liken it to GCSE art, right?
Mm.
GCSE art, you had to create a final piece. There was an exam where you create a piece. There was throughout the year you had to do this coursework and stuff like that, which would show how you'd arrived, how you'd experiment, and blah 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 blah. Which for me was all about what are you left with. So you're left with your final piece. The alchemist or philosopher's stone is that final piece. So when you've created that philosopher's stone, that is a physical symbol of work actually done. So there is actual philosopher's stones that you can create. And the point is, if you actually went through the quest and the process of creating that stone, there's no way that that wouldn't transform you in some way, shape, or form. Similar to Lee, if I'm trying to use another type of reference, which is there's no way that you could achieve an Olympic gold medal without having changed in some way, shape, or form from when you decided I'd like to be an Olympian, please. It's like
Mm.
that is a huge amount of training with something at the end. That thing at the end is a gold coated piece of aluminium, I believe. But
Mm.
it's so much more than that. The Philosopher's Stone is actually something that's normally quite a simple alchemical, experiment. However, it is the amount of work that's gone through into understanding each part. What you get when you have created that thing is a full understanding of the formula and how the formula worked. We teach in an alchemistic kind of way. If alchemistic is actually a word, I don't know, but it fucking should be. We
Alchemical.
teach four thieves vinegar because
Mm.
anyone could come up with a copy and pasting a four thieves vinegar recipe, but when they go into the understanding of what is the story of the four thieves, why am I ascribing only four